Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a long, slow stroll through the dusty fields and creaking barns of 19th century America. Imagine, if you will, the soft clucking of hens, the lowing of cattle, and the distant rumble of a horse-drawn plow. The air is thick with the scent of damp earth and hay, and the only light comes from a single lantern, swinging gently as you trudge through the yard, always counting the very lifeblood of your existence. You're bundled against the pre-dawn chill, your breath misting in the cool air, and you know deep down that you probably won't survive this journey into the minutiae of historical agricultural statistics without a serious dose of sleepiness. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're up for it, drop a comment below with where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing on the cusp of an era where wealth wasn't measured in Bitcoin or IPOs, but in the rustle of corn stalks and the number of hooves in your pasture. This was agrarian America, a land where the vast majority of its citizens lived and died by the rhythm of the seasons and the fertility of the soil. When we talk about how 19th century Americans counted their chickens, we're not just talking about poultry. We're talking about the very fabric of their economy, their survival, and their understanding of their place in a rapidly expanding world. The concept of a national census, as we understand it today, was still in its infancy. For most of the century, counting anything, let alone livestock, was a localized, often informal affair. You as a farmer knew your animals. You knew Bessie the cow who always gave the sweetest milk, and that one particularly stubborn rooster who ruled the roost with an iron claw. But beyond your fence line, those individual distinctions blurred into a generalized understanding of agricultural output. It was less about precise numbers and more about a general sense of productivity. Was your farm thriving? Were you holding your own against your neighbors? These were the pressing questions. Think about it: in a time before advanced spreadsheets or even reliable mail services, how would you even begin to tally every chicken, every pig, every sheep across a continent that was still largely untamed wilderness? The very idea seems daunting, almost absurd. Yet the seeds of what would become a sophisticated statistical system were being sown, albeit slowly, and often haphazardly. This rudimentary census-taking, simple as it was, reflected a profound truth about early American life. It was overwhelmingly agrarian. Your sustenance, your prosperity, your very existence hinged on the success of your crops and the health of your animals. It was a world where a bad harvest could mean starvation, and a healthy flock of chickens could mean a steady supply of eggs for trade or consumption. Historians still argue whether the perceived self-sufficiency of these early farms was a romantic ideal or a harsh reality. You see the challenges. How do you count what you can't easily see or track? Many animals roamed semi-wild, especially in the larger, less fenced-off tracts of land. Chickens, notoriously, were often left to forage for themselves, making a precise tally a daily, if not hourly, task of chasing down feathered fugitives. It was less about sitting down with a quill and ledger, and more about a mental inventory reinforced by the visual evidence of a bustling farmyard. And this initial, somewhat informal approach to counting was the bedrock upon which all future, more formal statistical efforts would be built. You were, in essence, an unwitting participant in the very first steps of agricultural data collection, one chicken cluck at a time. It's a far cry from today's satellite imagery and drone surveys, isn't it? Back then, your 2 feet and keen eyes were the only tools you needed, or rather the only tools you had. As you continue your mental stroll back in time, you're now stepping onto the shores of what would become the United States, but still very much a collection of disparate colonies. The concept of counting livestock, even something as humble as a chicken, wasn't a national initiative, but rather a patchwork of localized efforts driven by immediate needs. Imagine for a moment a colonial governor, perhaps in Virginia or Massachusetts, needing to assess the resources available to his fledgling settlement. He's not thinking about the national GDP. He's worried about feeding his people, provisioning his militia, and ensuring there's enough produce to trade with the arriving ships. These were the early colonial surveys, often more akin to inventories than formal censuses. You might be asked to report how many acres you cultivated, how many heads of cattle you owned, and yes, how many chickens scratched around your yard. But these counts were often inconsistent, varying wildly from one colony to another, and even from one year to the next within the same colony. There was no standardized form, no central authority dictating how information should be gathered. It was a rather chaotic ad hoc system, much like trying to get a straight answer out of a particularly cagey town elder about his secret squirrel stash. For instance, you might find that in the tobacco-rich fields of the Chesapeake, the focus was heavily on cash crops, and the labor human and animal required to cultivate them. Livestock, while essential, might have been given a more cursory count. Head north to the colder climes of New England, however, and the emphasis might shift to the hardy sheep providing wool for clothing, or the ubiquitous pigs and chickens that could survive the harsher winters. These regional variations in what was considered important to count tell us a lot about the distinct economic and environmental pressures facing each colonial settlement. One quirky tidbit you might stumble upon is that some colonial records don't just list numbers of animals, but occasionally include fascinating, almost anecdotal details. You might find a tax assessment mentioning 3 red cows, 1 lame, or 27 hens, including the one that lays double yolks. These small annotations, while not systematic, offer a fascinating glimpse into the personal relationship colonists had with their animals, a far cry from the abstract numbers on a modern agricultural report. It suggests a time when every creature had a story, or at least a distinguishing characteristic that made it countable in a more intimate way. The primary motivation for these early counts was often taxation, plain and simple. The colonial authorities wanted to know what assets you possessed, so they could levy taxes to fund public works defense, or the ever-present demands of the mother country. So when a representative came to your door, quill in hand, you might have been tempted to underreport your flock, perhaps discreetly shooing a few dozen hens into the woods before he arrived. This inherent incentive to minimize one's reported assets means that historians still argue whether these early colonial livestock counts truly reflect the full scope of animal husbandry, or were merely a baseline for taxation purposes. It's like trying to get an accurate count of cookies from a child who knows they're about to be rationed. You're bound to come up short. Beyond taxation, there was also a desperate need for resources in times of crisis. If a particularly harsh winter loomed, or a military conflict required provisioning troops, knowing the available stock of meat, wool, and eggs was crucial. You, as a colonist, were not just a farmer. You were a living, breathing component of the colonial economy, and your animals were your contribution to its survival. The very act of counting, however imprecise, was an assertion of control over a wild and unpredictable landscape, an attempt to bring order to the agrarian chaos of a new world. It was the genesis of what would much later become a sophisticated system of national accounting. You're now moving deeper into the 18th century, still firmly rooted in colonial America, and the sights and sounds of the farm are becoming even more vivid. Before the great upheaval of the Revolution, the livestock on your farm represented not just sustenance, but a form of liquid wealth. There were no banks on every corner, no stock market to invest in. Your animals, especially, the larger ones, were your savings account, your retirement plan, and your emergency fund, all clucking, grunting, and mooing their way through the barnyard. This period saw a fascinating variety of animals populating the burgeoning settlements. While chickens were undeniably ubiquitous, often scurrying beneath foot, you also had a menagerie of other creatures. Pigs were incredibly popular, their ability to forage for themselves and their rapid reproduction making them ideal for a frontier existence. They were the ultimate low-maintenance, high-yield investment. Sheep provided not just meat, but also that indispensable wool, crucial for warmth in harsh winters. Cattle, of course, were the workhorses, literally plowing fields, pulling carts, and providing milk, butter, and cheese. Horses, while vital for transportation and heavier farm work, were often a luxury, a significant investment for a farmer. One fascinating, if somewhat grim tidbit from this era is the sheer number of animals that roamed freely, particularly in southern colonies. Imagine not just your own chickens, but dozens of your neighbors as well, mingling and foraging. This made precise counting almost impossible, leading to a system where often owners would simply brand or mark their animals and hope for the best. Disputes over ownership of stray livestock were common, and local courts often dealt with cases of lost or stolen pigs and chickens. It was a bit like trying to keep track of a group of toddlers at a birthday party, all wearing identical outfits. The practicalities of daily life meant that every creature had a purpose. The chickens, your unassuming feathered friends, were the backbone of the daily diet, providing eggs and less frequently meat. They were the unsung heroes of the colonial kitchen. Their relatively small size and ease of keeping meant almost every household, rural or urban, kept a few. You didn't need vast acres to support a small flock. This is a mainstream historical fact. The widespread distribution of poultry made it one of the most accessible forms of protein for early Americans. But beyond the dinner table, these animals shaped the landscape and the culture. The paths they created through fields, the fertilization of the soil from their waste, the very sounds they made, these were integral to the colonial experience. Their presence dictated daily chores, seasonal routines, and even the architectural layout of farmsteads. You built your barn to shelter your cattle, your coop to protect your chickens, and your fences, if you had them, to contain your pigs. It was an ecosystem, a delicate balance between human needs and animal biology. Historians still argue whether the commonality of open-range grazing truly optimized land use or simply led to more disputes between neighbors. So while the idea of a national agricultural census was still decades away, the reality on the ground was a vibrant, bustling animal economy. You lived amongst your animals, you worked with them, and your very survival depended on their health and productivity. The way you counted them, or rather the way you knew them, was deeply personal, far removed from the cold statistics of later centuries. It was less about numbers on a page and more about the living, breathing wealth that scratched, snorted, and clucked its way through your colonial existence. You knew your flock not by a numerical tally, but by their sounds, their habits, and their contribution to your daily bread. The air shifts, and you feel the tremor of change, not just in the earth beneath your boots, but in the very fabric of society. The revolution has passed the ink on the Constitution is drying, and suddenly you're not just a colonist, you're an American citizen. This new nation, fledgling and ambitious, now faces the immense task of understanding itself, its resources, and its potential. This is where the concept of counting things, even humble chickens, begins to take on a more national significance. The period of post-revolutionary data collection marked a crucial, if slow, pivot from purely local inventories to a broader, more standardized approach. The newly formed United States government understood that to govern effectively, to tax fairly, and to plan for the future, it needed a clearer picture of its population and its productive capacity. This meant not just counting people, but also the animals that sustained them. The first federal census in 1790, however, was primarily focused on human population for representation purposes. Livestock data was still largely an afterthought or collected on an ad hoc basis by local officials. It was a bit like trying to plan a massive feast by only counting the number of guests, without any idea how many chickens or loaves of bread you actually had in the pantry. You might find yourself encountering early attempts at more formal surveys, perhaps through state initiatives or the nascent agricultural societies that were beginning to spring up. These efforts were often driven by a desire to promote better farming practices and to understand regional agricultural strengths and weaknesses. They weren't always mandatory, and participation often varied wildly depending on the zeal of the local official or the willingness of farmers to share their precious data. Imagine trying to convince your fiercely independent neighbor, who barely trusts the tax collector, to accurately report his prize-winning sow and her litter. It was a hard sell. One mainstream historical fact from this era is that the decennial census, mandated by the Constitution, slowly began to expand its scope beyond just human populations. While it would take some time to include detailed agricultural schedules, the underlying principle of a periodic nationwide count was established. This laid the groundwork for future, more comprehensive livestock surveys. It was a small seed barely visible, but destined to grow into a massive statistical oak. A quirky tidbit from this time reveals the lingering informal nature of these counts. Some early state-level agricultural reports would include not just numbers, but also subjective assessments. You might read entries like, Mr. Johnson's flock of sheep, though numerous, are rather scrawny, or the chickens in this district appear hardy, save for a few troubled by the pox. These personal observations, while charming, highlight the lack of scientific rigor that would come to define later statistical methods. Historians still argue whether the initial lack of federal oversight in agricultural data collection was a deliberate choice to allow states more autonomy, or simply an oversight in the priorities of a young nation. You, as a farmer in this era, might have viewed these early data collection efforts with a mix of suspicion and resignation. Another form to fill out another official asking questions about your livelihood. But perhaps, just perhaps, You also recognized the nascent potential. If the government truly understood the agricultural wealth of the nation, perhaps it could better support farmers, improve roads to market, or even provide assistance in times of blight or disease. It was a slow, sometimes painful transition from a purely localized, self-sufficient mindset to one that began to acknowledge the interconnectedness of a national economy. Your chicken clucking in your backyard was no longer just your chicken. It was a tiny feathered data point in the grand unfolding story of American agriculture. As the echoes of the revolution fade, you find yourself in a nation grappling with its identity. And at the heart of this discussion, surprisingly enough, is agriculture. Our next figure steps onto the stage, a man of enlightenment, ideals, a true polymath, Thomas Jefferson. His vision for America wasn't one of sprawling industrial cities, but of a virtuous republic built on the sturdy shoulders of independent yeoman farmers. This was Jefferson's agricultural vision, and it profoundly influenced how the young nation thought about its land, its people, and yes, its livestock. Jefferson, a gentleman farmer himself at Monticello, understood the intrinsic link between a thriving agricultural sector and a stable democratic society. He championed agricultural improvements, experimenting with new crops, plows, and techniques. For him, the land was not merely a source of wealth, but the very foundation of Republican liberty. This mainstream historical fact, Jefferson's emphasis on an agrarian republic, meant that the success of individual farms, and by extension the animals on them, became a matter of national interest, not just local concern. You might imagine Jefferson in his study, poring over reports not just of human populations, but perhaps also of crop yields and animal husbandry practices. While he didn't institute a detailed national livestock census himself, his philosophy created an intellectual climate where such data would eventually be seen as vital. He believed in the power of knowledge and systematic observation ideas that would slowly permeate the nascent government's approach to understanding its resources. It was less about a direct order to count every chicken, and more about cultivating the idea that knowing your agricultural assets was a civic duty and a national strength. A quirky tidbit from this era reveals the blend of scientific curiosity and practical need. Jefferson himself was fascinated by animal breeding and kept meticulous records of his own livestock, including detailed notes on the productivity of his sheep and the health of his horses. While these were personal records, they reflected a broader intellectual trend among the educated elite to apply scientific principles to farming. You can almost picture him, quill in hand, noting the number of eggs laid by a particular hen, or the weight gain of a young pig, a kind of proto-data scientist of the farm. However, the practicalities of a vast and decentralized nation meant that realizing Jefferson's vision for comprehensive agricultural data was a slow and arduous process. There was no single federal agency dedicated to agriculture until much later in the century. Data collection was often delegated to marshals performing the census, or to local societies with varying degrees of enthusiasm and expertise. Historians still argue whether Jefferson's agrarian ideal, while noble, was ultimately sustainable in the face of burgeoning population growth and the inevitable push towards industrialization. It's like trying to keep a river flowing in a perfectly straight line when it naturally wants to meander. For you, the farmer, Jefferson's ideals might have felt distant, yet they shaped the public discourse around your livelihood. The dignity of the farmer, the importance of independent land ownership, These were ideas that resonated, and within this framework, the counting of your livestock, however rudimentary, was implicitly understood as contributing to the greater good of the nation. Your flock of chickens wasn't just breakfast, it was a small clucking testament to the Republican values that the Founding Fathers, especially Jefferson, held so dear. It was a time when the humble farm animal was surprisingly a symbol of national aspirations. Now imagine you're not just tending your small plot in the well-established East, but you're packing up your life, hitching your wagon, and setting your sights on the vast, untamed lands beyond the Appalachians. This is the era of westward expansion's impact, a relentless push that reshaped not only the physical map of the United States, but also the very challenge of counting its agricultural wealth. As settlers flooded into new territories, the task of tracking livestock became exponentially more complex. You're no longer just dealing with settled farmsteads. You're carving out a living in new, often isolated communities. Fences are rare, land is abundant, and animals often roam with a freedom unheard of back east. How do you count your chickens when they might wander for miles, intermingling with wild fowl or the flocks of distant neighbors you barely know? The meticulous record-keeping, rudimentary as it was that you might have seen in the older states, often fell by the wayside in the raw practicality of frontier life. Survival was paramount, and detailed census-taking sometimes felt like a luxury. This geographical spread meant that the existing methods of data collection, already imperfect, were stretched to their breaking point. Local marshals tasked with counting the population would often make rough estimates for livestock, relying on their own observations or the word of the settlers themselves. There was little infrastructure for systematic surveys, and the vast distances made verification nearly impossible. It was a bit like trying to count grains of sand on an ever-expanding beach while simultaneously trying to build a sandcastle. A mainstream historical fact of this period is the immense growth in agricultural land and production fueled by westward migration and the promise of cheap land. As more acres came under cultivation and more animals were brought to new territories, the sheer volume of agricultural activity began to dwarf previous estimates. This rapid expansion, while a testament to American dynamism, also presented a significant hurdle for anyone attempting to gather comprehensive data. You could see endless fields and hear the calls of untold numbers of livestock, but getting a precise tally felt like a fool's errand. One quirky tidbit often overlooked is the role of nomadic livestock raising during this expansion. Some settlers would drive their herds, especially cattle and pigs, along with them for hundreds of miles, relying on natural forage along the way. These traveling farms were incredibly difficult to account for in any static census. Imagine a census taker trying to get an accurate count of your chickens when half of them are currently scratching for grubs. 3 counties over. This fluid movement of animals highlighted the limitations of a system designed for more settled communities. Historians still argue whether the perceived abundance of resources on the frontier led to more wasteful agricultural practices or simply adapted to the unique challenges of the environment. For you, the pioneer farmer, your count was often a pragmatic one. How many animals did you have healthy enough to survive the journey? How many could you protect from predators or disease in your new, unfamiliar surroundings? Your chickens, perhaps fewer in number than your eastern relatives, were even more precious. They were a living link to the home you left behind, a source of comfort and sustenance in a harsh new world. The raw challenge of simply existing often overshadowed the abstract need for statistical accuracy. The numbers that truly mattered were the ones that ensured your family's survival day by grueling day as you push the frontier ever further west. As you settle into your new, perhaps less wild homestead, whether in the burgeoning west or the more established east, you begin to truly grasp the intricate web of daily life on a 19th century American farm. This wasn't just a place of work. It was a self-contained universe, an intricate dance between humans, animals, and the land. This is the heart of the household economy, where every chicken, every cow, every patch of garden contributed directly to the family's survival and relative prosperity. Your farm was in many ways your factory, your grocery store, and your bank all rolled into one. You didn't typically run to a supermarket for your eggs or milk. You walked out to the coop or the barn. This meant that the number of animals you possessed wasn't just a statistical figure. It was a direct reflection of your family's daily calories, its ability to trade for goods it couldn't produce, and its buffer against hard times. A healthy flock of chickens meant consistent eggs for breakfast, and surplus eggs could be bartered for sugar coffee or cloth from a traveling peddler. This concept of self-sufficiency was a cornerstone of rural life. While not entirely isolated, your farm aimed to produce as much as possible to meet your family's needs. You grew your own grains, preserved your own vegetables, and raised your own meat. The chickens, those clucking, scratching marvels, were often the entry point for many households into animal husbandry. They required less land and less feed than larger animals, making them accessible to even the smallest landholders. This is a mainstream historical fact. The chicken was an indispensable part of the 19th century American household economy due to its low cost of entry and high utility. One quirky tidbit you might observe is the way children were often integral to the counting and care of these smaller animals. It wasn't uncommon for a child's chore list to include gathering eggs, feeding the chickens, or even helping to herd them back into the coop at dusk. This practical involvement meant that the count of chickens wasn't just a number on a ledger, it was a daily lived experience. A child knew how many eggs they collected, knew which hen was broody, and perhaps even had names for their favorite fowl. It was a hands-on, deeply personal connection to the numbers. The household economy wasn't just about production, it was also about meticulous resourcefulness. Nothing went to waste. Chicken manure was gathered for fertilizer. Feathers were used for bedding or quills, and older birds past their egg-laying prime would still end up in the stew pot. This circular economy meant that every animal, no matter how small, played multiple roles. Historians still argue whether this intense focus on self-sufficiency stifled innovation or fostered a resilient, adaptive spirit among rural Americans. It's like arguing if being forced to make your own bread from scratch makes you a better baker or just a very tired one. For you, the head of this household, the number of chickens, pigs, or cows wasn't just a statistic for some distant government official. It was a barometer of your family's well-being, a testament to your hard work, and a constant source of both comfort and concern. A sudden illness sweeping through your flock could be a minor inconvenience for a large farm, but for a household dependent on every single egg, it could be a small disaster. Your daily interactions with these animals, the sounds of their activity, the rhythm of their lives, were the very pulse of your existence in the 19th century. They weren't just assets. They were family members, co-inhabitants of your small, vital world. As you continue your journey through 19th century America, you realize that while formal federal censuses were slowly taking shape, much of the practical counting of agricultural output happened at a far more grassroots level. This was the domain of local records and almanacs, the informal but indispensable tools that helped farmers and communities keep a rough tally of their agricultural world. These weren't glossy government reports, but the everyday documentation and shared knowledge that oiled the gears of rural life. Imagine your local general store, its shelves brimming with goods, and on the counter next to the tobacco and hardtack, you spot a well-worn ledger. This wasn't just for credit accounts. It often served as a rudimentary local economic barometer. A store owner might keep track of how many dozens of eggs were traded for sugar, or how many pounds of pork were bartered for tools. These weren't official statistics, but they painted a very real picture of the community's productivity and consumption. You, as a farmer, might even informally report your own surpluses or needs to the storekeeper who served as a kind of central clearinghouse of local agricultural intelligence. Perhaps even more prevalent were the ubiquitous almanacs. These annual publications found in nearly every household were far more than just calendars. They contained weather predictions, astrological charts, recipes, and crucial farming advice, often tailored to specific regions. Within their pages, you might find articles discussing average crop yields, the best time to breed livestock, or even tips on identifying common animal diseases. While they didn't ask you to report your chickens, they often presented generalized figures or benchmarks that implicitly allowed you to compare your own flock's productivity to a perceived norm. This is a mainstream historical fact. Almanacs were a primary source of practical information and aggregated agricultural wisdom for 19th century farmers. A quirky tidbit from these almanacs reveals a fascinating blend of hard numbers and folk wisdom. Alongside advice on crop rotation, you might find remedies for ailing livestock that involved bizarre concoctions or superstitious practices, often presented with the same authority as a planting schedule. So while you might read about the average number of chickens a farm might sustain, you could also find a cure for chicken pox that involved hanging a horseshoe in the coop. It highlights the hybrid nature of knowledge dissemination at the time, where empirical observation mixed freely with age-old traditions. The very act of keeping these local records, however informal, speaks to a fundamental human need to quantify and understand one's world. Whether it was a farmer meticulously noting the number of eggs laid each week in a personal diary, or a community leader estimating the number of livestock to assess the town's food security, these were all forms of counting chickens that predated and ran parallel to any federal efforts. Historians still argue whether the reliance on these localized, often anecdotal records hindered the development of more robust national agricultural statistics, or simply reflected the practical realities of a decentralized society. It's like trying to get an accurate temperature reading for an entire country by only checking the thermometers in people's individual homes. So while no one was demanding a precise count of every single chicken in every single backyard, through these means the collective wisdom and fragmented data found in local ledgers and widely read almanacs provided a surprisingly rich, if unsystematic, understanding of agricultural life. You were both a consumer and a contributor to this information ecosystem, learning from the generalized trends, and in turn, shaping them with your own daily farm practices. It was a world where data wasn't big, but deeply personal and intensely practical. As your journey continues, you can't help but notice the humble fowl that seems to be everywhere you look in 19th century America, the chicken. Though often overlooked in grand historical narratives, its presence was so pervasive that it almost faded into the background. This section delves into the chicken's humble status, a creature so common, so integrated into daily life, that its very ubiquity made it hard to count with precision, yet impossible to ignore in its economic significance. You'd hear their clucking in every barnyard, see them scratching in every garden, and find their eggs on almost every breakfast table. Chickens were the ultimate low-maintenance livestock. They didn't require vast pastures like cattle, nor specialized feed like horses. They largely fended for themselves, foraging for insect seeds and scraps around the farmstead. This made them accessible to virtually anyone with a small plot of land, from the poorest frontier settler to the established farmer in the thriving eastern states. This is a mainstream historical fact. Chickens were the most widely distributed and easily kept livestock across all social classes in 19th century America. Their very adaptability contributed to the challenge of counting them. Unlike a herd of cows that might be contained in a pasture, or a stable, chickens often roamed freely. They'd fly over fences, roost in trees, and nest in unexpected places. Trying to get an accurate census of your own flock could be a daily scavenger hunt, let alone attempting to count every single chicken in a county or a state. You might try to count them as they went into the coop at night, only to realize half the flock had found a cozy spot under the porch. It was like trying to herd cats, but with more feathers and far less personal space. One quirky tidbit about their humble status is how infrequently they appear as individual named animals in historical records compared to horses or even cows. While you might find records of Old Bessie the cow, you're unlikely to find Henrietta the hen meticulously documented, unless she was a prize-winning showbird, which was rare for much of the century. They were often referred to in collective terms: the flock, the laying hens, the spring chickens. This anonymity speaks volumes about their perceived place in the hierarchy of farm animals, essential but not individually noteworthy for most farmers. Historians still argue whether this lack of individual recognition for chickens contributed to their underrepresentation in early agricultural statistics, or simply reflected their sheer numbers. Despite their unassuming nature, their collective output was immense. Eggs provided a daily source of protein and a ready commodity for trade. Their meat, while not as prized as beef or pork for special occasions, was a consistent, reliable food source. And their contribution to soil fertility through their scratching and droppings was an unquantified but vital service to the farm ecosystem. You can almost see the paradox: a creature so vital, so numerous, yet so taken for granted that its precise count often eluded even the most diligent record keepers. So as you reflect on the chicken's humble status, remember that their economic impact far outstripped their often overlooked presence in official counts. They were the background hum of the American farm, the unsung heroes of daily sustenance, clucking away quietly, contributing to the national well-being, one egg, one feather, one scratching foot at a time. They were the countless contributors, the silent majority of the 19th century agricultural landscape, and their very elusiveness in the records tells a story of fundamental utility. Continuing your journey through the rich tapestry of 19th-century American farm life, you begin to appreciate how each element, from the largest draft horse to the smallest buzzing bee, contributed to a grand self-sustaining system. This interconnectedness is the essence of farmstead self-sufficiency, a way of life where every part of the farm worked in harmony to provide for the family and often for the local community. It was an intricate living machine, and understanding it helps us understand the context of counting chickens. Imagine your typical farm. It wasn't just a field of corn. It was a complex ecosystem where grains fed the livestock provided manure to fertilize the fields, and the animals themselves provided meat milk, eggs, wool, and labor. Your chickens, as you know, scavenged for insects and discarded grain, converting them into valuable protein. The pigs rooted out edible plants and leftover scraps, turning what would be waste into marketable pork. This closed-loop system minimized external inputs and maximized internal output, a truly sustainable model long before the term became popular. This integrated nature meant that the health and productivity of one part of the farm directly impacted another. A robust corn harvest meant well-fed animals. Healthy animals meant rich manure for the next season's crops. It was a delicate balance that required constant attention and intuitive understanding from you, the farmer. You didn't just count your chickens. You understood their relationship to the garden, to the compost pile, and to the well-being of your family. This is a mainstream historical fact. 19th-century American farms largely operated as highly integrated self-sufficient units. A quirky tidbit from this period is how diversified most farms were, even small ones. Specialization, where a farmer might only raise chickens or only grow wheat, was rare. Instead, you'd find a little bit of everything: a few cows, a pig or two, a flock of chickens, a vegetable patch, an apple orchard, and perhaps some grain fields. This diversity was a form of risk management. If one crop failed or one type of animal suffered a disease, you had other sources of food and income to fall back on. It was like having multiple backup plans, all clucking, mooing, and rustling around your farm. The very act of living this self-sufficient life meant that precise numerical counts of every single item weren't always the priority. Instead, you developed an intuitive sense of abundance or scarcity. You knew if your hens were laying well just by the size of the egg basket each day, not by checking a spreadsheet. You could estimate the health of your pig population by the sounds from the ST. It was a qualitative assessment, born of daily observation and ingrained experience. Historians still argue whether this reliance on practical, intuitive knowledge, rather than precise data, made farmers more resilient or less efficient in the long run. For you, the farmer, managing this intricate farmstead was a continuous balancing act. Every decision, from planting schedules to breeding choices, affected the whole. The animals, your faithful partners in this endeavor, were not just individual units to be tallied. They were vital breathing components of your personal ecosystem. The chickens pecking in the yard were not just 20 chickens. They were the providers of your family's breakfast, the recyclers of your kitchen scraps, and the very embodiment of your farm's resilience. Their quiet contributions underscored the profound self-sufficiency that defined so much of American life in the 19th century. Stepping away from the immediate concerns of the individual farmstead, you notice a broader movement gaining momentum across the young nation. This was the rise of early agricultural societies, voluntary associations of farmers landowners, and gentlemen scientists who shared a common goal to improve American agriculture. These groups were crucial in pushing for more systematic ways of understanding and, yes, counting the nation's agricultural wealth. Imagine a gathering in a local hall, perhaps dusty from disuse, but filled with the earnest voices of men debating the merits of different plow designs or the best methods for rotating crops. These societies, which began forming in the late 18th century and proliferated throughout the 19th, weren't government agencies. They were grassroots efforts driven by a desire for progress and shared knowledge. They published journals, held fairs, and organized lectures, becoming vital hubs for disseminating information that had previously been passed down orally or through informal networks. One of their key contributions was advocating for better record keeping, and by extension, more accurate data collection. They understood that to truly improve, you first had to measure. They would encourage members to keep detailed farm journals, noting everything from planting dates and yields to livestock births and deaths. While these were individual efforts, their collective advocacy helped lay the intellectual groundwork for standardized agricultural statistics. This is a mainstream historical fact. Agricultural societies played a significant role in promoting scientific farming methods and systematic data collection in the 19th century. A quirky tidbit from these societies is their enthusiasm for competitive exhibitions. Imagine farmers proudly displaying their prize-winning cattle, their plumpest pigs, or yes, their most prolific laying hens at county fairs organized by these societies. These contests, while seemingly just for entertainment, actually served as informal benchmarks. You might hear whispers about Farmer Johnson's hens laying a dozen eggs a day, which, while not a formal count, contributed to a collective sense of what was achievable and what good production looked like. It was like a very early, very low-tech version of a leaderboard but for livestock. These societies also frequently lobbied state and federal governments for more attention to agricultural matters, including funding for research and better data collection. They understood that individual efforts, while valuable, could only go so far. A national picture required national effort. Historians still argue whether the focus of these societies on gentleman farming and scientific methods sometimes overlooked the practical realities and traditional knowledge of the average subsistence farmer. It's like a group of architects designing a house without ever asking the people who will actually live in it. For you, the farmer joining such a society might have felt like a step into a more modern world. You might attend a meeting, listen to a speaker discuss new sheep breeds, or share your own experiences with chicken rearing. These interactions and the data they encouraged you to collect, even if just for your own purposes, subtly shifted your perspective. Your animals were no longer just creatures on your farm. They were part of a larger agricultural enterprise, a national endeavor to improve and prosper. The collective counting, the shared knowledge fostered a sense of belonging to something larger than your own fence line. You feel the slow, almost imperceptible shift in the air, a movement from local initiative to national imperative. The early agricultural societies may have planted the seeds, but the federal government was gradually taking up the shovel. This brings us to the federal census innovations, a slow but steady evolution in how the decennial count began to truly grapple with the immense task of quantifying the nation's agricultural wealth, including its feathered residents. For many decades after its inception, The U.S. Census was primarily a head count of people crucial for political representation. But as the 19th century progressed and the nation grew, the understanding of its economic engine, agriculture, became increasingly important. The government realized it couldn't truly understand its population without understanding how that population fed itself. This meant that the humble chicken, once merely a personal asset, was slowly gaining statistical significance on a national scale. The turning point, a mainstream historical fact, came with the 1840 census, which marked the first time that detailed agricultural statistics were systematically collected on a national level. For the first time, marshals going door to door weren't just asking about the number of people in your household. They had specific schedules for agricultural products, including livestock. You, as a farmer, would be asked to report the number of your horses, cattle, sheep, swine, and yes, your poultry. This was a monumental step, a recognition that the clucking masses in your backyard were indeed vital economic indicators. However, don't imagine a sleek digital questionnaire. The methods were still incredibly rudimentary. Marshals were often local men, not trained statisticians, and their instructions, while more detailed than before, still left room for interpretation. The farmer might give a rough estimate, or the marshal might take a quick glance and make an educated guess. It was less about precise, verifiable data and more about getting a broad national snapshot. It was a bit like trying to count the stars in the night sky with a blurry pair of binoculars. A quirky tidbit that often emerges from the instructions given to census marshals is the ambiguity surrounding certain categories. For poultry, for instance, it wasn't always clear if they meant all poultry, chickens, ducks, turkeys, geese, or just chickens. And what about young chicks? Were they counted? Were they included if they hadn't yet reached a certain age or size? These subtle inconsistencies meant that the chicken count from county to county, or even farm to farm, could vary wildly based on the marshal's interpretation and the farmer's willingness to be thorough. Historians still argue whether the initial federal census data accurately reflected the diversity of agricultural practices or was skewed by these methodological limitations. For you, the farmer, this federal census visit might have been a new experience. It was a formal intrusion, a government official asking about your private economic life. You might have felt a mixture of pride in your productive farm and perhaps a touch of suspicion, wondering what these numbers would be used for. But regardless of your personal feelings, your chickens were now officially counted, their numbers contributing to a national narrative of abundance and productivity. It was the genesis of big data for agriculture, born from the simple act of a census marshal ticking boxes on a paper form in your rural backyard. Having witnessed the nascent attempts at national agricultural data collection, you now observe a subtle but significant shift unfolding across the American landscape. Your chickens, once primarily for your family's direct consumption, begin to acquire a new kind of value beyond your immediate needs. This is the era of from backyard to market, a gradual but profound transformation that saw chicken raising evolve from a purely subsistence activity to a commercial enterprise. For much of the early 19th century, if you had surplus eggs or an extra chicken, you might trade them with a neighbor, or perhaps sell a few dozen at the nearest general store or local market town. The scale was small and the reach limited. But as population centers grew, particularly in the burgeoning cities, so too did the demand for readily available food. City dwellers couldn't keep their own chickens, or at least not enough to meet their needs. This created a new economic incentive for farmers to raise more chickens, produce more eggs, and sell them for cash. This growing market demand began to professionalize poultry farming, albeit slowly. You as a farmer might start thinking about your chickens not just as providers for your table, but as a source of steady income. This meant perhaps investing in more co-ops, feeding them more systematically, and even considering specific breeds known for their egg-laying capabilities or meat quality. This is a mainstream historical fact. The growth of urban centers directly fueled the commercialization of poultry farming in the 19th century. One quirky tidbit about this transition is the emergence of egg peddlers, or poultry hucksters. These individuals would travel from farm to farm, collecting eggs and live chickens, then transport them to market, often over considerable distances. Imagine the challenges keeping eggs from breaking on bumpy roads, ensuring live chickens arrived healthy, and dealing with varying prices and demand. These middlemen were crucial bridges between the scattered rural producers and the hungry urban consumers, and their very existence demonstrated the growing commercial viability of poultry. It was a bit like an early, very analog supply chain, complete with its own set of logistical nightmares. The shift to market production also subtly influenced how you as a farmer might think about counting your chickens. While a precise daily tally might still be elusive, you would certainly be more focused on weekly egg production, the number of birds ready for market, and the overall health of your flock as a business asset. The qualitative understanding of your chickens began to be supplemented by a more quantitative, profit-driven assessment. Historians still argue whether this commercialization led to a decline in genetic diversity among chicken breeds as farmers favored traits for production over hardiness. So your backyard, once solely dedicated to feeding your family, slowly became a small part of a larger economic network. The clucking and scratching of your chickens resonated not just with the rhythms of your farm, but with the distant hum of urban commerce. This transition from pure subsistence to market-driven production marked a significant step in the integration of individual farmsteads into the broader national economy, transforming the humble chicken into a valuable commodity on a much larger scale. As the commercial currents begin to shape your understanding of your feathered friends, you also start to notice subtle differences among them. Not all chickens, it turns out, are created equal. This brings us to breeds and their impact, a fascinating aspect of 19th century poultry keeping that influenced not only what ended up on your plate, but also indirectly how chickens were valued and eventually how they might be counted. For much of the century, the vast majority of chickens were what you'd call dunghill fowl, or common chickens, a diverse mix of local varieties that had evolved through generations of natural selection and informal breeding. They were hardy, self-sufficient, and excellent foragers, but not necessarily exceptional layers or fast-growing meat birds. Their primary value was their sheer resilience and their ability to convert kitchen scraps into eggs and occasional meat. However, as the commercial market for eggs and poultry expanded, and as agricultural societies championed, improvement interest began to grow in specialized breeds. Fancy fowl shows, initially popular in England, started to gain traction in America. Suddenly you might hear whispers of Shanghai or Cochin. Chickens, exotic large breeds imported from Asia, prized for their size and impressive plumage. These birds were quite a sight, often much bigger and more stately than your common barnyard hen. This is a mainstream historical fact. The mid-19th century saw a significant increase in the importation and popularization of new chicken breeds, particularly those from Asia. A quirky tidbit from this era is the sheer obsession some fanciers developed for these new breeds. They weren't just about utility, they were about prestige and aesthetics. People would pay considerable sums for a purebred specimen, and local newspapers would report on the winners of poultry shows with the same fervor as they might report on a horse race. Imagine the pride in showing off your particularly fluffy cochin, even if it meant fewer eggs for breakfast. This shift in focus from purely utilitarian value to aesthetic and breeding potential began to subtly change how people perceived and therefore accounted for their chickens. These new breeds, whether for meat or eggs, brought with them a new level of economic calculation. If you invested in a specific laying breed, you'd be far more inclined to keep meticulous records of their egg production. If you had a breed known for its meat, you'd track its weight gain more closely. This internal record-keeping, driven by economic incentives, was a more precise form of counting than a simple head count of the whole flock. Historians still argue whether the craze for exotic breeds genuinely improved the overall productivity of American poultry or primarily served as a hobby for the affluent. It's like arguing if competitive baking truly makes bread better for everyone, or just creates very elaborate, expensive cakes. For you, the farmer, the proliferation of breeds meant choices. Do you stick with your hardy common fowl, or do you invest in a purebred, hoping for better yields and higher profits? These decisions were a microcosm of the larger economic forces at play. Your method of counting, even if informal, started to become more nuanced, differentiating between the everyday layers and the valuable breeding stock. The simple act of counting chickens was no longer just about numbers. It was about recognizing value potential and the impact of selective breeding on your burgeoning farm economy. Just as your attention shifts to the fascinating world of chicken breeds and their economic potential, you are suddenly reminded of the ever-present vulnerability that lurked beneath the surface of 19th-century farm life. No matter how meticulously you counted your flock or how carefully you bred your prize layers, there was always the specter of disease and its devastation. A single outbreak could wipe out an entire flock, turning a bustling coop into a silent, grim reminder of nature's unpredictable power. Imagine walking into your chicken coop one crisp morning, expecting the usual chorus of clucks and rustles, only to find a stillness. A few birds are listless, feathers, ruffled heads drooping. Within days, the symptoms spread. What started as a few sick chickens rapidly escalates into a full-blown epidemic, claiming dozens, then hundreds of your feathered charges. In an era before widespread veterinary medicine, antibiotics, or even a solid understanding of germ theory, such outbreaks were catastrophic. The most common culprits were diseases like fowl cholera, rupa respiratory infection, or various forms of poultry pox. These diseases could spread like wildfire through a closely confined flock, especially as commercial operations began to concentrate more birds in smaller areas. A mainstream historical fact is that poultry diseases were a constant and significant threat to agricultural productivity in the 19th century, leading to substantial economic losses for farmers. The lack of effective treatments meant prevention, often through isolating sick birds or culling entire flocks, was the only viable, albeit brutal, strategy. A quirky tidbit from this period is the array of folk remedies and superstitious practices that farmers would try in desperation. You might hear of concoctions involving turpentine pepper, or even ashes administered with varying degrees of success, mostly none. Some farmers believed in burying a dead bird at the corner of the coop to ward off further sickness, or hanging specific herbs to purify the air. These practices, while quaint to our modern understanding, highlight the sheer helplessness farmers felt in the face of widespread disease. It was like trying to stop a wildfire with a garden hose, all while praying to a deity you weren't sure was listening. The impact of disease on counting was profound. A census marshal might count your vibrant flock in July, only for a devastating outbreak in August to reduce it to a fraction of its former size. This meant that any snapshot count was inherently perishable, a fleeting moment in the dynamic, often brutal reality of animal husbandry. The numbers, therefore, were less about a static total and more about a volatile, constantly fluctuating inventory. Historians still argue whether the underreporting of disease outbreaks in official records masks an even greater impact on overall agricultural output than is currently understood. For you, the farmer, a disease outbreak wasn't just a loss of numbers, it was a profound personal and economic tragedy. Every dead chicken represented lost income, lost food, and a setback to your family's well-being. It instilled a deep sense of humility and a stark reminder of your reliance on forces beyond your control. The act of counting in the aftermath of such devastation would have been a grim tally of what was lost rather than a proud summation of abundance, emphasizing the fragile line between prosperity and ruin in 19th century farming. Having grappled with the devastating impact of disease, you might wonder, how exactly did these 19th century farmers and census takers actually perform their counts? Forget sophisticated sensors or automated tallies. This was a world of direct physical engagement. This section focuses on the technological counting aids of the era, which often amounted to little more than common sense and basic human ingenuity. Imagine yourself as a census marshal lantern, in hand entering a dimly lit barn or a bustling farmyard at dawn. Your primary technology for counting was your own pair of eyes aided by the farmer's memory and perhaps a very basic understanding of arithmetic. You'd visually estimate the size of a flock, or perhaps ask the farmer to drive his animals through a narrow gate, one by one, manually ticking off each pass on a tally stick or a slate. It was a laborious, time-consuming process, and accuracy often depended more on the diligence of the individual than on any scientific method. For chickens, the challenge was particularly acute due to their small size and tendency to scatter. There were no chicken counters that automatically recorded each bird entering a coop. Instead, a farmer might try to count them as they roosted for the night, a somewhat less chaotic endeavor than trying to count them during the day. Or they might simply estimate based on the average daily egg production or the general busyness of the coop. This is a mainstream historical fact. Direct visual estimation and manual tallying were the predominant methods for counting livestock throughout the 19th century. A quirky tidbit from this period is the occasional use of physical markers. For larger herds, a farmer might use a system of notched sticks, with each notch representing 10 or 20 animals. For smaller numbers, they might use pebbles, moving one from one pocket to another, for each animal counted. While not truly technology, these simple aids were essential for keeping track, especially when dealing with hundreds of animals. Imagine fumbling with pebbles in a dark barn, trying not to drop any, while a dozen chickens dart past your feet. It's a comedic image, but it highlights the practical limitations of the time. The technology also extended to the forms themselves. The federal census schedules, while increasingly detailed, were still paper-based, filled out by hand. Errors were common misspellings, illegible handwriting, or simple arithmetic mistakes could easily creep into the data. And once collected, the data had to be painstakingly compiled, often by clerks manually summing figures from thousands of individual forms. There were no computers to crunch the numbers. It was a human endeavor from start to finish. Historians still argue whether the inherent imprecision of these manual counting methods significantly impacted the accuracy of national agricultural trends drawn from census data. So when you picture the 19th century American counting chickens, erase any image of modern tools. Instead, envision a farmer or a census marshal squinting in the early morning light, perhaps with a stubby pencil and a dog-eared notebook, relying on their keen eyesight, their memory, and the simple act of marking off one animal at a time. It was a testament to human persistence, a slow and painstaking process that laid the foundation for the complex statistical systems we take for granted today. Your count was personal, manual, and often an educated guess born of necessity. With the limitations of rudimentary counting methods firmly in mind, you begin to grasp just how much the 19th century farmer relied on something far less tangible than a tally stick or a census form. This was the farmer's intuition, a deep ingrained understanding of their land, their animals, and the subtle rhythms of nature. It was often the primary tool for assessment, allowing for estimations that, while not numerically precise, were profoundly accurate in a practical sense. Imagine you, the farmer, walking through your fields or your barnyard. You wouldn't need a detailed spreadsheet to know if your crops were healthy or if your livestock were thriving. You could feel it. You'd observe the sheen on a cow's coat, the vigor with which your chickens scratched for food, the sound of their contented clucking. These were all qualitative indicators that for a seasoned farmer spoke volumes about the state of their farm. It was a holistic, sensory-driven understanding that surpassed mere numbers. When it came to counting chickens, your intuition told you if the flock felt right. You knew if egg production was up or down simply by the weight of the basket you carried in each day. You'd notice if a hen was missing, not because you had a precise count recorded, but because the flock felt smaller. This intimate daily interaction bred a kind of numerical fluency that didn't require formal arithmetic. This is a mainstream historical fact. Experienced 19th century farmers often relied heavily on intuitive judgment for assessing farm productivity and animal health. A quirky tidbit from this reliance on intuition is the prevalence of farmers' almanacs and local folk wisdom, as we discussed earlier. These were often born from generations of accumulated intuitive knowledge, codified into general guidelines. Plant corn when oak leaves are the size of a squirrel's ear is a prime example, not a precise date, but an intuitive indicator based on natural cues. Similarly, a farmer might gauge the health of his chickens not by a scientific test, but by observing their droppings or the color of their combs, drawing on a lifetime of observational data. It was like a very sophisticated internal algorithm constantly processing environmental data points. This intuitive approach wasn't a rejection of counting, but rather a different kind of counting. It was less about absolute figures and more about relative changes and overall trends. Was your flock larger this year than last? Were the hens laying more eggs than your neighbors? These comparative intuitive assessments were often more immediately useful to the farmer than a precise number that might only be collected once every 10 years by a census taker. Historians still argue whether this strong reliance on intuition sometimes led to missed opportunities for systematic improvement, or if it was simply the most practical and efficient method given the technological constraints. For you, the farmer, your intuition was your most valuable asset, honed by years of direct experience. It allowed you to manage your farm efficiently, to anticipate problems, and to make daily decisions without the need for extensive record keeping. The clucking, scratching, and bustling of your chickens weren't just background noise. They were constant data streams feeding into your internal sense of their numbers, their health, and their contribution to your family's daily survival. This intimate understanding formed the true count that guided your life on the 19th century American farm. You've seen the farmer's intuitive knack for understanding his flock, but now you shift your gaze to a different perspective, one that wrestled with those very intuitions and the messy reality of the data. This is the world of the statistician's challenge, the formidable task faced by those early government officials and nascent academics who tried to make sense of the scattered, often imprecise agricultural figures of the 19th century. They weren't just counting chickens. They were trying to build a coherent national picture from a million individual, often contradictory anecdotes. Imagine you're one of these early statisticians in a dimly lit government office, surrounded by stacks of handwritten census forms, each filled out by a different marshal with varying degrees of diligence. You're trying to figure out how many chickens exist in Ohio or what the national egg production looks like. The numbers don't always add up. Some farmers might have rounded aggressively. Others might have simply forgotten to count their newest batch of chicks. You'd encounter inconsistencies, missing data points, and categories that weren't always clearly defined. It was like trying to complete a massive jigsaw puzzle where half the pieces are missing and the other half don't quite fit. One of the biggest hurdles was the sheer lack of standardization. As we've explored, there was no uniform definition of poultry or livestock across all states or even all marshals. When should a chick be counted as a chicken? Was a pigeon counted if it was kept for meat? These seemingly minor ambiguities compounded across millions of farms, creating significant margins of error. This is a mainstream historical fact. The lack of consistent definitions and collection methods significantly hampered the accuracy of early 19th century agricultural statistics. A quirky tidbit from this challenge is the creative, sometimes desperate measures statisticians would employ to correct or interpret the data. They might try to apply rough multipliers based on population density, or compare figures to known local market sales to see if they seemed plausible. Sometimes they'd simply have to make an educated guess, a statistical intuition born of frustration. Imagine trying to develop a precise national average for egg production when some reports just say many chickens and others give a specific but possibly inaccurate number. It was a constant battle between the desire for precision and the reality of the data. Historians still argue whether the early national agricultural statistics, despite their flaws, were sufficient for guiding policy decisions or simply provided a rough, often misleading outline of the nation's agricultural capacity. The work of these early statisticians was often thankless. They were trying to impose order on an inherently chaotic system to quantify a sprawling decentralized economy. They were building the very framework of agricultural economics from the ground up with limited tools and even more limited reliable data. Their reports, dry and numerical, as they seemed, were the foundation upon which future agricultural policies, trade agreements, and understanding of national wealth would be built. So while the farmer was counting his chickens in the yard, these statisticians were in their offices, grappling with the numbers, trying to decipher the collective clucking of a nation. They faced a monumental challenge, but their persistence in the face of widespread imprecision laid the essential groundwork for the sophisticated agricultural data collection we rely on today. Your humble chicken counted or miscounted in your backyard became a tiny yet vital data point in their grand, often frustrating endeavor to understand the economic heartbeat of America. Having witnessed the struggles of the early statisticians, you now sense a new dawn breaking over the horizon of American agriculture. The whispers of change, once faint, grow louder, signaling the slow but inevitable push towards more scientific, rigorous methods. This is the era of whispers of modernization, a period where the seeds of what would become our modern agricultural data collection were finally beginning to sprout, moving beyond intuition and into systematic inquiry. The mid to late 19th century saw increasing recognition, particularly from federal government departments, that more reliable agricultural statistics were essential for national planning and economic development. The sheer size of the country and the growing complexity of its agricultural markets demanded better data. This led to calls for more detailed census schedules, better training for marshals, and eventually the creation of dedicated federal bodies to oversee agricultural matters. It was a gradual understanding that you couldn't effectively manage a nation's food supply and economic health with just guesswork and local anecdotes. One of the most significant steps, a mainstream historical fact, was the establishment of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, USDA, in 1862. While initially focused on research and education, its very existence signaled a federal commitment to agricultural improvement, which inherently required better data. The USDA would eventually become the central hub for collecting, analyzing, and disseminating agricultural statistics, including those related to poultry. This was a game-changer, transforming the fragmented, often unreliable counting efforts into a professionalized, systematic endeavor. A quirky tidbit from this period is the early attempts at agricultural surveys that went beyond the decennial census. These might include annual reports on specific crops or livestock conducted by state agricultural departments, or even by volunteer crop correspondents who would send in regular reports from their local areas. Imagine a dedicated farmer, perhaps you, sitting down each month to meticulously record your egg production, or the number of new chicks, then sending that data off to a state office. These efforts, though still imperfect, represented a conscious move towards more frequent and specialized data collection, complementing the broad strokes of the decennial census. It was like moving from taking a single blurry photo every 10 years to taking multiple slightly clearer snapshots more regularly. However, despite these strides, the path to fully reliable data was still long and winding. Challenges like inconsistent reporting, varying definitions, and the sheer logistical difficulties of collecting data across a vast and diverse nation persisted. Historians still argue whether the early focus on quantifiable output driven by these modernization efforts sometimes overlooked the qualitative aspects of farm life and the environmental impacts of changing agricultural practices. For you, the farmer, these whispers of modernization meant that the government's interest in your farm was becoming more consistent, more detailed. You might find yourself filling out longer forms or even receiving visits from individuals specifically tasked with agricultural surveys. It was a recognition that your chickens, your crops, and your hard work were not just matters of personal sustenance, but critical components of a national economy that was growing and industrializing. The era of casual counting was slowly but surely giving way to a new age of precision and systematic inquiry, laying the very groundwork for the sophisticated agricultural data we take for granted in the 21st century. And so your long, quiet journey through the 19th century draws to a close. We've counted chickens both literally and figuratively, from the rough estimates of colonial homesteads to the burgeoning, if imperfect, national statistics. As you stand here at the cusp of the 20th century, you can look back and see the profound legacy of the humble count. How these early, often painstaking efforts laid the invisible but indispensable groundwork for the complex, data-driven agricultural systems of today. Imagine the direct lineage from a farmer visually estimating his flock, to a census marshal manually tallying figures, to the dedicated statisticians grappling with imperfect data in their offices, all of it leading to the sophisticated data models and projections used by the USDA today. Each hesitant step, each missed count, each hard-won piece of information contributed to this grand evolution. The simple act of wanting to know how many chickens transformed into a foundational pillar of national economic understanding. This legacy isn't just about numbers, it's about the shift in mindset. It's the transition from an isolated, purely subsistence-based understanding of agriculture to a recognition of its national, indeed global economic importance. Your chickens, once just a source of daily eggs, became part of a larger market influenced by scientific breeding and tracked by federal agencies. This transformation, catalyzed by the desire to count, enabled better resource allocation, informed policy decisions, and ultimately helped feed a rapidly growing nation. This is a mainstream historical fact. The cumulative efforts of 19th century agricultural data collection were fundamental to the development of modern agribusiness and food security. A quirky tidbit that encapsulates this legacy is how surprisingly long some of the basic counting challenges persisted, even into the early 20th century. Estimating free-ranging chickens remained an art as much as a science. Census forms would evolve, but the fundamental challenge of getting every last bird accounted for, especially in remote areas, meant that a certain degree of estimation was always present. It reminds us that even with modern technology, sometimes the most basic realities of life, like a scattered flock of chickens, resist perfect quantification. Historians still argue whether the inherent imprecision in historical agricultural data leads to an underestimation of the true productivity and resilience of 19th century American farms. For you, the farmer, the shift from knowing your animals by sight and instinct to seeing them as part of larger national trends might have been a subtle one. But it was happening all around you. Your daily chores, the rhythm of your farm, were increasingly interwoven with the broader economic currents that these counts helped illuminate. The numbers, however crude, became a language, allowing a nation to understand its agricultural heartbeat. Now, as the moonlight filters softly through your window, and the last traces of historical clucking fade into the night, you can feel the quiet hum of history settling around you. The story of counting chickens in 19th century America is not a tale of grand battles or towering achievements, but of persistent, often mundane efforts that collectively built the statistical backbone of a nation. It's a reminder that even the most colossal structures begin with the smallest, most repetitive, and sometimes most boring bricks. As you drift further now, the images of dusty farmyards and earnest census takers grow soft at the edges, blurring into the peaceful quiet of your own space. The sounds of clucking hens become just a whisper, folding gently into the background hum of your fan. There's no longer a need to tally, no need to estimate, just the comforting sense that all those forgotten counts, all those careful scribbles on paper, served a purpose far grander than anyone might have imagined at the time. Your mind can release the weight of the numbers, the debates, the definitions. Let the scattered bits of historical data disperse like motes of dust in a sunbeam, settling into the vast, calm expanse of your subconscious. The work of counting is done for tonight. The chickens are safe in their coops, the fields lie quiet under the stars, and the centuries have rolled onward. Feel yourself sink deeper, letting go of every lingering thought, embracing the simple, profound peace that follows a long journey.